What? Mad that I'm eating fruit snacks off a plate? Bro, you're literally eating Fruit Loops with, what is this? Almond milk. It's basically soy milk. This is my intro now, until I get a better one. Hello everyone. First video, I'm excited. And it's a long one. It's a video essay. If you want to skip past all the farewell address stuff, I should have timestamps in the description. But I suggest you watch the entire video. It's not all going to be the Washington address. It's going to seem like that for the first half hour because it's a long address. And I'm going to analyze it, talk about it, and I think it's really important. But just know that there's more coming that is actually, something I'm saying, my words, not just the farewell address. And I'm not reading the full farewell address either, and I am also adding a lot to it. So it will be good for you to watch this and not just read it online, although I suggest that you do read the full address online at some point if you can, because Washington's farewell address is one of the great orations of history, of American history at least, and he really goes into some great stuff in it, so I suggest that you read it. Now, this video essay is the introduction to a series of video essays I will be releasing, hopefully about every other week. I say hopefully because with college and work, I'm a pretty busy guy, and believe it or not, this video and this series are over 2 years in the making. Obviously, I haven't spent every second of those 2 years making this video, but it took a lot of time to make this, and it's going to take a lot of time to make other videos. Hopefully, I'll be releasing one every few weeks or so. I'll always try to make my videos come out at midnight, because why not? In this series, I will go over some of the main problems America faces today, as well as their underlying issues, which I will go into a lot more detail on later. I'm calling the series America, Culture, and Christianity, as those are the topics that will be the main focus of the series. The first essay, in particular, this one, gives a brief overview of today's political climate. Later videos will cover philosophy, a little bit of apologetics, the sexualization of our culture, that's going to be fun, maybe, liberalism, and the church. Everyone's going to be excited for that one, right? Yeah, okay. Also, I will probably create a Rumble account to post this video on there, but first it's going to be on YouTube. Some of the stuff I say may get me kicked off of YouTube, which is why I'm hopefully going to have backups, but it shouldn't. I'm going to try to avoid that, but knowing YouTube, it might. So, in America today, the Trump presidency, the Biden presidency, the coronavirus pandemic, and the following lockdowns have highlighted and perhaps contributed to underlying issues of our country that have destroyed our union and our democratic republic. These issues are nothing new, as even our founding fathers predicted many of the struggles our nation now faces. In George Washington's farewell address, there lies an unfollowed warning to not fall into the trap of party politics and to preserve American ideals. He states the following: "The unity of government which constitutes you one people is also now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is a main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, the support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize. But, as it is easy to foresee that, from different causes and from different quarters, much pains will be taken, and many artifices employed to weaken in your minds the conviction of this truth, as this is the point in your political fortress against which the batteries of internal and external enemies will most constantly and actively, though often covertly and insidiously, directed. It is of infinite moment that you should properly estimate the immense value of your national union to your collective and individual happiness, that you should cherish a cordial, habitual, and immovable attachment to it, accustoming yourselves to think and speak of it as the palladium of your political safety and prosperity, watching for its preservation with jealous anxiety, discountenancing whatever may suggest even a suspicion that it can in any event be abandoned, and indignantly frowning upon the first dawning of every attempt to alienate any portion of our country from the rest, or to enfeeble the sacred lies which now link together the various parts. As we dive into what Washington is saying, I want to point out how smart of a man Washington was. All of the founding fathers of this great nation were extremely intelligent individuals, and I think modern thinkers look over the genius of our founders because they lived 250 years ago. These guys were smart, even by today's standards, and because their brains were more focused on thinking and less distracted by the brain-numbing devices of the modern era, they probably were much smarter than any modern thinkers in the matter of politics and philosophy. They obviously had access to less resources than we do, less information, especially because they're one of our resources, and so they may know less than we do. But in terms of base intelligence, they could compete with anyone. Just listen to how refined every word Washington uses is. That's not just Old English. That's a well-thought-out oration. In fact, Washington even uses a word here that 99% of you probably didn't know until now, palladium. Some of you may know it as an element on the periodic table, but the word itself means safeguard, if you were wondering. And I was, because I had to Google it. So there you go. I'm dumb, I guess. Anyways, it is clear to me that Washington foresaw exactly what is currently happening to our country. He first talks about how American unity is extremely valuable and how people will try to destroy it. They have succeeded. He then goes into how we can try to prevent disunity by holding fast to our sacred ties. What are those sacred ties? Let's see if he says later in the address. For this, you have every inducement of sympathy and interest. Citizens, by birth or choice of a common country, that country has a right to concentrate your affections. The name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. With slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. You have, in a common cause, fought and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils and joint efforts of common dangers, sufferings, and successes. Guys, we are no longer a common country. We have been divided. The name American does not concentrate all our affections, and it does not exalt the just pride of patriotism. We do not have the same religion, manners, habits, or political principles. And by the way, all of those things matter. We do not fight for a common cause anymore. And we do not possess nearly as much independence and liberty as we used to. How did this happen? Furthermore, notice how Washington says the name American should exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. First of all, for those of you who don't understand the vocabulary of the 18th century, appellation basically just means name, and I'm probably saying it wrong, so don't judge me. Secondly, going against Washington here is destroying our national unity, and we are doing so. Being a Texan or Floridian is much different than being a Californian today, and many people are simply not patriotic anymore. Both problems cause issues. Let's continue. But these considerations, however powerfully they address themselves to your sensibility, are greatly outweighed by those which apply more immediately to your interest. Here, every portion of our country finds the most commanding motives for carefully guarding and preserving the union of the whole. And keep in mind, I am skipping parts. This is one of the parts I will be skipping. While then, every part of our country thus feels an immediate and particular interest in union, all the parts combined cannot fail to find in the united mass of means and efforts greater strength, greater resource, proportionably greater security from external danger, a less frequent interruption of their peace by foreign nations, and, what is of inestimable value, they must derive from union an exemption from those broils and wars between themselves which so frequently afflict neighboring countries not tied together by the same governments, which their own rival ships alone would be sufficient to produce, but which opposite foreign alliances, attachments, and intrigues would stimulate and embitter. Now guys, keep in mind, this video is going to be very long, so I don't have time to say every word correctly. And I am terrible at getting in tongue twisters, as I just did. So, I'm sorry ahead of time. Let's continue. I'm just ranting, guys. This is great, obviously. High quality content for my first video, guys. Hence, likewise, they will avoid the necessity of those overgrown military establishments which, under any form of government, are inauspicious to liberty, and which are to be regarded as particularly hostile to republican liberty. In this sense, it is that your union ought to be considered as a main prop of your liberty, and that in contemplating the causes which may disturb our union, it occurs as a matter of serious concern that any ground should have been furnished for characterizing parties by geographical discriminations, northern and southern, Atlantic and western, whence designing men may endeavor to excite a belief that there is a real difference of local interests and views. One of the expedients of party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts. You cannot shield yourselves too much against the jealousies and heartburnings which spring from these misrepresentations. They tend to render alien to each other those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection. The inhabitants of our western country have lately had a useful lesson on this head. They have seen, in the negotiations by the executive, and in the unanimous ratification by the Senate of the treaty with Spain, and in the universal satisfaction at that event, throughout the United States, a decisive proof how unfounded were the suspicions propagated among them of a policy in the general government and in the Atlantic states unfriendly to their interests in regard to the Mississippi. They have, been witnesses to the formation of two treaties, that with Great Britain and that with Spain, which secure them everything they could desire in respect to our foreign relations towards conforming their prosperity. Will it not be their wisdom to rely for the preservation of these advantages on the union by which they were procured? Will they henceforth be deaf to those advisers, if such there are, who would sever them from their brethren and connect them with aliens? Washington talks about a lot here, and I still can't get over how dense and deeply intellectual Washington's speech was. If a politician talked like this today, nobody would understand them, which is why most of our politicians are dumb, or at least talk like they are, which isn't always a bad thing, really. They get elected by money, party, and looks. In other words, if they look and sound good, or have no huge scandals, at least compared to their opponent, and they have enough money for an effective ad campaign, and almost blindly promise to follow the correct party depending on the district, they will be elected. Anyways, as for what Washington is saying, in this section, he mostly warns against foreign conflicts, not only because arguments over these conflicts will cause disunity, just look at the last 50 years of American wars and how they have affected our unity. It wasn't good, obviously, but because an extremely large military, in Washington's opinion, is potentially harmful to republican liberty. To the efficacy and permanency of your union, a government for the whole is indispensable. No alliance, however strict, between the parts can be an adequate substitute. they must inevitably experience the infractions and interruptions which all alliances in all times have experienced. Sensible of this momentous truth, you have improved upon your first essay by the adoption of a constitution of government better calculated than your former for an intimate union and for the efficacious management of your common concerns. I said that word wrong. Who cares? By the way, he is talking, of course, about the Articles of Confederation. Read your history, guys. It's a good thing. Anyways, this government, the offspring of your own choice, or our own choice, uninfluenced and unawed, adopted upon full investigation and mature deliberation, completely free in its principles and the distribution of its powers, uniting security with energy and containing within itself a provision for its own amendment, has a just claim to your confidence and support. Respect for its authority, compliance with its laws, acquiescence in its measures are duties enjoined by the fundamental maxims of true liberty. The basis of our political systems is the right of the people to make and to alter their constitutions of government. But the constitution which at any time exists till changed by an explicit and authentic act of the whole people is sacredly obligatory upon all. The very idea of the power and the right of the people to establish government presupposes the duty of every individual to obey the established government. That's important, guys. All obstructions to the execution of laws, all combinations and associations, under whatever plausible character, with the real design to direct, control, counteract, or all the regular deliberation and action of the constituted authorities, are destructive of this fundamental principle and of fatal tendency. They serve to organize faction, to give it an artificial and extraordinary force, to put in the place of the delegated will of the nation the will of a party, often a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community, and, according to the alternate triumphs of different parties, to make the public administration the mirror of the ill-concerted and incongruous projects of faction, rather than the organ of consistent and wholesome plans digested by common councils and modified by mutual interests. Wow. Washington hit the nail on the head. Obviously, he's Washington. He's awesome. He hit it with every word that he said. He basically said, America has a great constitution that allows us to make amendments to it, because our fathers are smart enough to know that times change. However, he stated, we should not be able to change or usurp/undermine the authority of the Constitution or do things that hinder its execution. We have the right to choose how we want to be governed, yes, as government is by the people, right? But once we choose that government, we do not have the right to break all of the rules out of a sense of freedom. In other words, once we establish a government, especially a government we can change through voting or processes that can change our Constitution, we need to do what it says. Washington sums it up nicely when he says, the very idea of the power and the right of the people to establish government presupposes the duty of every individual to obey the established government. When we elect partisan judges to the Supreme Court or other courts, or even worse, just add judges randomly so that your political party has more judges in the Supreme Court, which is completely unconstitutional, or other courts and not constitutional judges, right? Trump actually kind of did a good job of trying to pick constitutionalists. When that happens, we are fighting against the very document we must hold fast to. Furthermore, Washington calls any organization that tries to direct, control, counteract, or all the regular deliberation and action of the constituted authorities fatal to our system. These organizations serve the will of the party, not the country. We'll get into that a lot more later, but it's obviously a huge problem. Our bureaucracy is a part of it. Megacorporations are a part of it. Partisan judges are a part of it. Corrupt departments, like the Department of Justice, are a part of it. Let's continue. The love of the one ought to endear you to the preservation of the other. These considerations speak a persuasive language to every reflecting and virtuous mind, and exhibit the continuance of the Union as a primary object of patriotic desire. Is there a doubt whether common government can embrace so large a sphere? Let experience solve it. To listen to mere speculation in such a case were criminal. We are authorized to hope that a proper organization of the whole, with the auxiliary agents of governments for the respective subdivisions, will afford a happy issue to the experiment. It is well worth a fair and full experiment. With such powerful and obvious motives to union, affecting all parts of our country, while experience shall not have demonstrated its impracticability, there will always be reason to distrust the patriotism of those who in any quarter may endeavor to weaken its bands. However, combinations or associations of the above description may now and then answer popular ends, they are likely, in the course of time and things, to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. Does this sound familiar? I hope so, because it is happening right now. A lot of this is. I will continue. Towards the preservation of your government and the permanency of your present happy state, it is requisite not only that you steadily discountenance irregular opposition to its acknowledged authority, but also that you resist with care the spirit of innovation upon its principles, however specious the pretext. One method of assault may be to effect, in the forms of the Constitution, alterations which will impair the energy of the system, and thus to undermine what cannot be directly overthrown. That's important, guys. In all the changes to which you may be invited, remember that time and habit are at least as necessary to fix the true character of governments as of other human institutions, that experience is the surest standard by which to test the real tendency of the existing constitution of a country, that facility in changes upon the credit of mere hypothesis and opinion exposes to perpetual change from the endless variety of hypothesis and opinion, and remember especially that for the efficient management of your common interests in a country so extensive as ours, a government of as much vigor is as consistent with the perfect security of liberty is indispensable. Liberty itself will find such a government, with powers properly distributed and adjusted, its surest guardian. It is, indeed, little else than a name, where the government is too feeble to withstand the enterprises of faction, to confine each member of the society within the limits prescribed by the laws, and to maintain all in the secure and tranquil enjoyment of the rights of person and property. So basically, part of what this is saying is that the government's job is to keep the peace and protect God-given liberties. The majority is also just stating that our Constitution will be tested with experience, as many doubted back then when it was written how such a document could work. It was kind of an experiment. At the end of this section, notice how Washington clearly defines the right to property, which is under attack by many. Washington continues. I have already intimated to you the danger of parties in the state, with particular reference to the founding of them on geographical discriminations. Let me now take a more comprehensive view, and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally. This spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature, having its root in the strongest passions of the human mind. It exists under all different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed, but in those of the popular form, it is seen in its greatest rankness, and is truly their worst enemy. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual, and sooner or later the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. This warning about political parties was not one we heeded, obviously. I keep saying obviously, but it's like this stuff is just clear. And the results of our failure are once again predicted by Washington. I feel like I'm repeating myself. It's point after point he makes that it's just like, nope, we're not doing that. We're not doing that. We're not doing that. Let's keep going. Without looking forward to an extremity of this kind, which nevertheless ought not to be entirely out of sight, the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. It serves always to distract the public counsels and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which finds a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. There is an opinion that parties in free countries are useful checks upon the administration of the government and serve to keep alive the spirit of liberty. This, within certain limits, is probably true, and in governments of a monarchical caste, patriotism may look with indulgence, if not with favor, upon the spirit of party. But in those of the popular character, in governments purely elective, it is a spirit not to be encouraged. From their natural tendency, it is certain there will always be enough of that spirit for every salutary purpose, and there being constant danger of excess, the effort ought to be by force of public opinion to mitigate and assuage it. A fire not to be quenched, it demands a uniform vigilance to prevent it bursting into flame, lest, instead of the warning, it should consume. Once again, Washington just analyzes the effects of a system of parties and how that affects politics. And he warns against it, and we didn't follow it. I'm repeating myself, but just every time. It is important, likewise, that the habits of thinking in a free country should inspire caution in those entrusted with its administration, to confine themselves within their department, to encroach upon another. The spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all the governments and all the departments in one, and thus to create, whatever the form of government, a real despotism. A just estimate of that love of power and proneness to abuse it, which predominates in the human heart, is sufficient to satisfy us of the truth of this position. The necessity of reciprocal checks in this exercise of political power, by dividing and distributing it into different despotaries, and constituting each the guardian of the public weal against the invasions by the others, has been evinced by experiments, ancient and modern, some of them in our country and under our own eyes. To preserve them must be as necessary as to institute them. If, in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way which the Constitution designates. But let there be no change by usurpation, for though this, in one instance, may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. The precedent must always greatly overbalance in permanent evil any partial or transient benefit which the use can at any time yield. Here, Washington talks about the importance of not letting any branch of government use power entrusted to another branch. In other words, the judicial and executive branches shouldn't be making laws, and the legislative branch shouldn't be enforcing or interpreting law. We have also failed at this, at least partially. Washington also warns against overthrowing the system entirely, as free governments are destroyed by usurpation, even if usurpation can be used for good, like it was in the American Revolution. We no longer need to do this because our Constitution allows us to make amendments if the founders were wrong, or we learn that something in our Constitution didn't work. Let's keep going. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of duties of men and citizen. The mere politician, especially equally with the pious man, ought to respect and cherish them. A volume could not trace all their connections with private and public felicity. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are instruments of investigation in courts of justice? And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. Here, Washington makes the argument that religion is necessary to the running of our government. This is true, and one reason why our government seems to be failing is that Christianity is being replaced with atheism or other religions that do not share the biblical morality our country requires. This is important, and Washington reiterates this. It is substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. The rule indeed extends with more or less force to every species of free government. Who that is a sincere friend to it can look with indifference upon attempts to shake the foundation of the fabric. Promote then as an object of primary importance institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge. In proportion as the structure of a government gives force to public opinion, it is essential that public opinion should be enlightened. Here, Washington presents the amazing idea that participants in a democratic republic should definitely be educated and well-versed upon political issues. I wonder if that's an issue today. As a very important source of strength and security, cherish public credit. One method of preserving it is to use it as sparingly as possible, avoiding occasions of expense by cultivating peace, but remembering also that timely disbursements to prepare for danger frequently prevent much greater disbursements to repel it, avoiding likewise the accumulation of debt, not only by shunning occasions of expense, but by vigorous exertion in time of peace to discharge the debts which unavoidable wars may have occasioned, not ungenerously throwing upon posterity the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. The execution of these maxims belongs to your representatives, but it is necessary that public opinion should cooperate. To facilitate to them the performance of their duty, it is essential that you should practically bear in mind that towards the payment of debts there must be revenue, that to have revenue there must be taxes, that no taxes can be devised which are not more or less inconvenient and unpleasant, that the intrinsic embarrassment inseparable from the selection of the proper objects, which is always a choice of difficulties, ought to be a decisive motive for a candid construction of the conduct of the government in making it, and for a spirit of acquiescence in the measures for obtaining revenue, which the public exigencies may at any time dictate. Here, Washington basically said that taxes are a necessary evil, but the government should do everything in its power to stay debt-free, spend as little as possible. That aged poorly. Once again, we did not listen to Washington at all. And I'm starting to realize that maybe the reason America is falling is that we basically completely ignored the guy who had a huge role in creating this country and definitely knew how it should be run. Observe good faith and justice towards all nations. Cultivate peace and harmony with all. Religion and morality enjoin this conduct, and can it be that good policy does not equally enjoin it? It would be worthy of a free, enlightened, and at no distant period, a great nation, to give to mankind the magnanimous and too novel example of a people always guided by an exalted justice and benevolence. Who can doubt that in the courses of time and things, the fruits of such a plan would richly repay any temporary advantages which might be lost by a steady adherence to it? Can it be that Providence has not connected the permanent felicity of a nation with its virtue? This experiment, or the experiment at least, is recommended by every sentiment which ennobles human nature. Alas, is it rendered impossible by its vices? In the execution of such a plan, nothing is more essential than that permanent, inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachment for others should be excluded, and that in place of them just and amicable feelings towards all should be cultivated. The nation which indulges towards another a habitual hatred or a habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. It is a slave to its animosity or to its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and its interest. Antipathy in one nation against another disposes each more readily to offer insult and injury, to lay hold of slight causes of umbrage, and to be haughty and intractable when accidental or trifling occasions of dispute occur. Hence, frequent collisions, obstinate, envenomed, and bloody contest. The nation, prompted by ill will and resentment, sometimes impels war to the government, contrary to the best calculation of policy. The government sometimes participates in the national propensity and adopts through passion what reason would reject. At other times, it makes the animosity of the nation subservient to the projects of hostility instigated by pride, ambition, and other sinister and pernicious motives. The peace often, sometimes perhaps the liberty, of nations has been the victim. So likewise, a passionate attachment of one nation for another produces a variety of evils. Sympathy for the favorite nation, facilitating the illusion of an imaginary common interest in cases where no real common interest exists, and infusing into one the enmities of the other, betrays the former into a participation in the quarrels and wars of the latter without adequate inducement or justification. It leads also to concessions to the favorite nation of privileges denied to others, which is apt doubly to injure the nation making the concessions by unnecessarily parting with what ought to have been retained, and by exciting jealousy, ill will, and a disposition to retaliate in the parties from whom equal privileges are withheld. And it gives to ambitious, corrupted, or deluded citizens who devote themselves to their favorite nation facility to betray or sacrifice the interests of their own country without odium, sometimes even with popularity, gilding with the appearance of a virtuous sense of obligation, a commendable deference for public opinion, or a laudable zeal for public good, the base or foolish compliances of ambition, corruption, or infatuation. As avenues to foreign influence in innumerable ways, such attachments are particularly alarming to the truly enlightened and independent patriot. How many opportunities do they afford to tamper with domestic factions, to practice the arts of seduction, to mislead public opinion, to influence or awe the public councils? Such an amendment of a small or weak towards a great and powerful nation dooms the former to be the satellite of the latter. Against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, I conjure you to believe me, fellow citizens, the jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of republican government. But that jealousy, to be useful, must be impartial, else it becomes the instrument of the very influence to be avoided, instead of a defense against it. Excessive partiality for one foreign nation and excessive dislike of another cause those whom they actuate, to see danger only on one side, and serve to veil and even second the arts of influence on the other. Real patriots, who may resist the intrigues of the favorite, are liable to become suspected and odious, while its tools and dupes usurp the applause and confidence of the people to surrender their interests. The great rule of conduct for us in regards to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations, to have with them as little political connection as possible. So far as we have already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. Here let us stop. Europe has a set of primary interests, which to us have none, or a very remote relation. Hence, she must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our concerns. Hence, therefore, it must be unwise in us to implicate ourselves by artificial ties in the ordinary vicissitudes of her politics, or the ordinary combinations and collisions of her friendships or enmities. Our detached and distant situation invites and enables us to pursue a different course. If we remain one people under an efficient government, the period is not far off when we may defy material injury from external annoyance. When we may take such an attitude as will cause the neutrality we may at any time resolve upon to be scrupulously respected, when belligerent nations, under the impossibility of making acquisitions upon us, will not lightly hazard giving us provocation, when we may choose peace or war, as our interest, guided by justice, shall counsel. Why forego the advantages of so peculiar a situation? Why quit our own to stand upon foreign ground? Why, by interweaving our destiny with any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, humor, or caprice? It is our true policy to stay clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world, so far, I mean, as we are now at liberty to do it. For let me not be understood as capable of patronizing infidelity to existing engagements. I hold the maxim to be no less applicable to public than to private affairs, that honesty is always the best policy. I repeat it, therefore, let those engagements be observed in their genuine sense, but, in my opinion, it is unnecessary and would be unwise to extend them. Taking care always to keep ourselves by suitable establishments on a respectable defensive posture, we may safely trust to temporary alliances for extraordinary emergencies. Harmony, liberal intercourse with all nations are recommended by policy, humanity, and interest. But even our commercial policy should hold an equal and impartial hand, neither seeking nor granting exclusive favors or preferences, consulting the natural course of things, diffusing and diversifying by gentle means the streams of commerce, but forcing nothing, establishing, with powers so disposed in order to give trade a stable course, to define the rights of our merchants, and to enable the government to support them. Conventional rules of intercourse, the best that present circumstances and mutual opinion will permit, but temporary and liable to be from time to time abandoned or varied as experience and circumstance shall dictate, constantly keeping in view that it is folly in one nation to look for disinterested favors from another, that it must pay with a portion of its independence for whatever it may accept under that character, that by such acceptance it may place itself in the condition of having given equivalents for nominal favors, and yet of being reproached with ingratitude for not giving more. There can be no greater error than to expect or calculate upon real favors from nation to nation. It is an illusion, which experience must cure, which a just pride ought to discard. So I know I just read a lot. That was dense, but all of that was basically Washington saying we should stay neutral in terms of foreign policy and not concern ourselves in pointless wars in the rest of the world that do not involve us. Once again, we have failed at this in every way possible. Even now, many want to fight for Ukraine, giving American lives for a nation that has nothing to do with American interests. What good does helping Ukraine or random Middle Eastern countries do for the average American? Nothing. Furthermore, Washington warns of being too attached to certain nations and too opposed to others. Once again, we failed at this. It's no wonder our country is going downhill. Finally, we're almost done now. Washington says this: "In offering to you, my countrymen, these counsels of an old and affectionate friend, I dare not hope they will make the strong and lasting impression I could wish, that they will control the usual current of passions, or prevent our nation from running the course which has hitherto marked the destiny of nations. But, if I may even flatter myself that they may be productive of some partial benefit, some occasional good, that they may now and then recur to moderate the fury of party spirit, to warn against the mischiefs of foreign intrigue, to guard against the impostures of pretended patriotism, this hope will be a full recompense for the solicitude of your welfare, for by which they have been dictated. How far in this discharge of my official duties I have been guided by the principles which have been delineated, the public records and other evidences of my conduct must witness to you and to the world. To myself, the assurance of my own conscience is, that I have at least believed myself to be guided by them." That's it. That was long. But here we go. And now we get into the bulk of the essay and the part that I'm actually writing. Guys, I'm by no means a journalist, political pundit, or scholar. I'm simply a normal, concerned citizen who pays attention to what is happening in the world. And I want to provide insight from a commoner who by no means is doing any of this for money or power. I have no desire to be in politics at all. In fact, I'm currently an aspiring band director. Why should you listen to me? To be honest, you shouldn't really take everything I say as absolute fact, and I admit that. But you can trust me to be honest in my opinions. I am biased, and I do not study these things for a living, necessarily, but at least with me, you know, I am unmotivated by my own power, as so many with political influence are, and I do believe I can provide a nuanced perspective that acknowledges flaws from all sides when they exist. I also have thought deeply on these issues, reading books about them and researching them, so I am certainly not uninformed, and a lot of what I will talk about is philosophical or biblical, two things I think I have a pretty good grasp on, if I'm going to brag a little bit. I shouldn't do that, but hey. This is not an endorsement for any candidate or party. In fact, it is quite the opposite. And when I provide examples of a person or party doing things I agree with or disagree with, it does not mean I support them or their opponent necessarily. To be upfront about my possible biases, I did vote for Trump in the 2020 election, and I know that this may turn many people away from this video, but know that I by no means support everything Trump did or said, and if you cannot handle reading or hearing a perspective from my side, then you are part of the problem with American politics today, and I encourage you to help the situation by reading or listening to this with an open mind. We all have beliefs that may push us to instantly discount anything said by someone on the other side of the intellectual aisle. But to fix our country, we must at least attempt to understand each other. That being said, I beg you to at least listen to this, or read it. I will probably have a link to the written essay in the description. Whether you support the same things I support or not, just read it or listen to it, as it should be insightful for all sides. If you consider yourself conservative, as I do politically, this will serve as a possibly new perspective, as I believe many conservatives are fighting the wrong battles and losing badly. If you consider yourself left-leaning, I think you may be surprised with how much I agree with you on some things. Certainly not everything, especially if you're a communist. But even if you aren't, like I said earlier, I find it essential to understand the true perspectives of others, even those you disagree with, and to hear it from them, not externally motivated political pundits. As you probably have guessed based on the title of this paper and the table of contents, which I will probably also post in the description, there's going to be a lot of stuff in there, I will be discussing what I believe are fundamental problems in American society that are leading to the sharp division in our nation. While I will bring up examples of these problems, think of this paper more as a political essay than a news article, as I will try to dig deep into underlying issues, not the talking points that dominate the media in the current atmosphere, although I may bring some current events up to give examples. I hope you enjoy this, but I also hope you will, at the very least, come to an understanding with my point of view. And at most, maybe your mind will be changed, and you'll want to take action to save our country. Okay, our current political system is a joke. I think many people on all sides can agree with that. Many of us feel forced to vote Republican or Democrat because if we vote for a different candidate, third party, they will almost definitely lose. I think we can acknowledge that both Joe Biden and Donald Trump had flaws. Neither truly represented all that we believed in, but we all chose to vote for one or the other because they were better than the other, and there were no third options who actually had a shot at winning. Like I said earlier, I voted for Trump. I agree with him on many things. Abortion, foreign policy, getting us out of wars in the Middle East, signing peace treaties, putting America first in trade. Those are all part of the foreign policy I like. The Second Amendment and economic policy. But he also stands for many things I stand against. He can be very self-centered. He often tweets instead of taking action. And many of the things he says are honestly kind of disgusting. Despite these flaws, I voted for him because he was much better than Biden, in my opinion. I'm sure many of you Biden voters will admit that you don't support everything Biden does. Maybe you think he's a little corrupt or his economic policies aren't great. Maybe he's too old. Maybe he doesn't go far enough with many policies if you're progressive, even if they lean in your direction. You still voted for him. Why? You voted for a man who you thought was much better than Trump. So, why is this a problem? Why doesn't the system work? In my opinion, voting for a person is by definition flawed because people are flawed, and they may not line up with everything you believe in. The result, the elected official ends up being truly supported by almost no one, as voters may be voting against the other candidate and not for their own candidate. We can see this in the low approval ratings of both presidents. This problem manifests on both sides, and not only in the presidency. Senators and representatives are either Democrat or Republican, and incumbents often get the nomination. So not much ever changes. Term limits, maybe. We'll see. We'll talk about how to fix this later a little bit. As a result, our leaders strive for power more than people. They serve themselves over the interests of the people because they know that as long as they have a D or an R next to their name and they're in the right district, people will vote for them. Sadly, this results in undemocratic Democrats and unrepublican Republicans who don't vote for policies that support you. An example of this would be someone like Mitt Romney. He's a Republican in name only, or what we call a neoconservative who runs in a Republican district, winning only because he is a Republican, despite the fact that he often votes against Republican values. How does that represent the people who voted for him? It does not. However, the other side of this issue is the fact that politicians often vote along party lines to keep their base happy, so nothing gets done. There's kind of like two sides to the issue, right? As citizens, we need to realize that the failure of our government is our fault because we voted for our leaders. Understand right now that you don't have to vote for them. Spread the word. Make every effort to put people in office who truly represent the people. It is too late to add a new party, as people are fairly set voting for either Democrat or Republican, but we can choose what person runs for their party in the primaries, so do it. The country needs you to be informed and vote for someone who isn't corrupt, who has your interests in mind. That's really tough to do, I understand this. As the saying goes, absolute power corrupts absolutely. We need to vote people out if they don't support us. That begs the question, how do we know what they believe? How do we vote for someone who we are uninformed of? I will talk about that later. Another thing to note is that while you individually may vote for a candidate based on research, most voters do not. The vast majority of voters are either uninformed or informed by a corrupt media who trains them to vote in a certain way. This means that whoever controls the media controls the country. Keep that in mind. Besides our two-party system, there's a lot of division among the parties as well, which leads to further discontent. Among Republicans, there are those in the alt-right who many would describe as racist and overly nationalist, as well as other more moderate groups. One group I would call establishment Republicans. They are the dying breed of Republican who seem to hate Donald Trump, fight for power more than their constituents, and support globalism and not America First foreign policy. They support endless wars in the Middle East and compromise on key issues of conservatism. Then there are the libertarians, who are not technically Republicans, but are more likely to line up with the Republican Party, at least recently, because they support more freedom through things like lower taxes and protecting our rights. The final group, who many libertarians have joined, are the Trump supporters, a new group rising from a hate for the political establishment, a love of America First policies, and also the traditional support for Republican stances on abortion, tax and regulation cuts, pro-religious freedom policies. This new group, basically more of a populist group, also distrust big corporations, especially media corporations, despite their more general support for capitalism and a free market economy. Among Democrats, there are the far-left radicals, which include Antifa, BLM supporters who agree with socialist ideas and tearing down the system. Surprisingly, this group actually shares ideas with Trump supporters who want to tear down the establishment. The difference is that Trump supporters support capitalism and reforming our policies through the Constitution, while radical leftists want to tear both of these structures down completely. Similar to the far right, the far left has caused a lot of violence in this country, especially with the recent protests turned riots following the death of George Floyd. In fact, leftist violence has definitely far exceeded right-wing violence as of late, mostly because they have had the backing of the political establishment. Other protesters of George Floyd's death who were peaceful and didn't riot include what is now the mainstream left. People who believe our country is and has always been racially unjust. They support gun regulation, economic regulation for the purpose of environmental preservation, more programs like socialized health care and forgiven student loan debt, and more regulation on speech from sites like Twitter and Facebook. They support abortion and the supposed right of a woman to her own body, and higher taxes, mostly on the wealthy. Another faction is the moderate left, most of whom believe in legal yet restricted abortion, regulation within reason, and an Obamacare-like healthcare system. They are less concerned with constricting free speech, but they do want more gun regulation. They support the poor and want to tax the rich, but maybe not to socialist extremes. Obviously, even within these groups, there are differing opinions. For example, some Democrats do not support abortion, and no group is a true monolith. However, I do believe that these groups can be defined, at least partially, in the groupings I have described. So, why do these factions matter, and how are they destroying our country? For one, the extremist groups on both sides often cause violence. But for another, it seems that our country is becoming more polarized than ever. A few years ago, what I am describing as a mainstream leftist would be considered radical. Similarly, Trump is possibly the most conservative president since Ronald Reagan. Sadly, people on each side often defend their radical groups as they believe the other side's radical group is worse, which only polarizes everything even further. On the other hand, I have noticed that more mainstream Republicans apologize for the actions of their side's radical groups, while Democrats often defend or fail to acknowledge the extremism of their groups like Antifa or BLM. For example, many were calling Antifa just an idea, and many more think that BLM is a normal, moderate political movement simply protesting racial inequality. Meanwhile, it is actually a much more radical movement that supports communism, the destruction of the nuclear family, and false narratives of police brutality, all under a feel-good name that makes everyone feel compelled to support it. Because who could disagree with the statement, Black Lives Matter? Almost no one. Except for, in their opinion, the alt-right, but whatever. Or all white people. That's a new opinion, but it's coming up. Anyways, differences in opinion aren't wrong, but we are now in a place where each faction believes that people on the other side do not deserve even an opinion, and where radicals come to define increasing portions of the parties. When one side supports something, the other instantly assumes it is wrong. For example, it was actually conservatives who first suggested wearing masks as an alternative to lockdowns. Democrats like Dr. Fauci actually told us not to wear masks, as they were needed for hospital workers and the sick. As lockdowns ended and conservatives began to argue for freedom by not supporting mask wearing, Democrats began to support mask wearing. We have come to the point where the other side is always wrong and there's no compromise. It's no wonder we are divided. The result of this division is that not only are there two parties at war with each other, but there are also extremists in each group that allow for even further division. I do believe there is an even deeper issue at play here, but I will discuss that later. There aren't many people who would dispute the fact that Trump is a divisive leader, but whether that is his fault or the fault of the Democrats and the mainstream media is up for debate. Obviously, President Trump has flaws that do nothing to help us unify. He tweets too much, he's very confrontational, and he seems to have a huge ego. He is human. All humans have flaws. Yet one reason why he is so divisive, besides his rhetoric, is that he is the first Republican president, in my lifetime at least, who is somewhat effective at what he does. Like him or not, Trump's vision has not changed in the slightest since he got in office, and he has followed through with many of the promises he made. He began building the wall, he cut regulations and taxes to create a great economy, and he put America First policies as a high priority on the world stage. He was the first president to say he wanted to move the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem and actually do it. And he is the first president in a while to not start or get involved in any new wars. While some of those things are controversial, there are other things he has done that should be good news for all Americans. And that gets to the second source of division in our country, the mainstream media. I will go into more detail on this later, a lot. But it is very clear that normally accepted news organizations like CNN or MSNBC have a clear anti-Trump agenda. I don't know their hearts, but it seems to me that they have nothing but pure hatred for Trump, and that only pisses off Trump supporters while simultaneously pissing off Democrats who think their life is awful simply because of the president. In my opinion, the solution to this is simple, yet possibly very hard to execute. We must, first of all, stop hating people in general, no matter how bad you think they are for our country. I know that's impossible in today's political climate, but it must happen. So we do need dramatic change. This is why John Adams and many other founding fathers knew that our Constitution would only work for a moral and religious people. This was brought up in Washington's farewell address. Liberty only works when you acknowledge that there is a God and you follow his commands, because otherwise liberty would seem to be doing whatever we want. In order to truly love people, we must realize God's love for us. Second of all, we must realize that our Constitution is a well-made document which puts checks on the president. So while the office certainly matters, it is unlikely that one singular person could single-handedly destroy our country. Keep in mind that the president cannot make laws. That is the job of Congress. And the president can also be impeached and removed if needed. On a side note, I find it interesting that the party who believes Trump is a fascist simultaneously wants to give more power to the government. Finally, take everything you hear from any news source with a grain of salt. No news organization is perfect or truly unbiased, so try to sort out the correct information from various sources. The phrase Big Brother comes from the book 1984 by George Orwell. This book warns of the dangers of authoritarianism, which can manifest on both the left and the right. It is my opinion that today we have a tri-partite Big Brother. The first part is big media, which includes old media like CNN, MSNBC, ABC, The Washington Post, The New York Times, Fox News, and the Associated Press. These are companies who have already been established for years and, up until recently, were the most trusted news sources in the nation. Most, still, are trusted by many. Trump is again against what he calls fake news, and there are many merits to his argument. In fact, a wave of new media is on the rise, mostly on social media platforms like YouTube, which gives more varying opinions on topics and are normally more upfront about their political biases. The main problem with most of these older companies is not that they are biased, but that they refuse to acknowledge it. A simple look at a press conference now shows that the questions raised at Trump are much harsher and harder than the questions given to Joe Biden, especially Joe Biden, but even to an extent, Barack Obama. And political comedy shows like Colbert, Fallon, and Kimmel seem to have the same anti-Trump jokes playing on repeat. Criticizing the president is not wrong, but it is so one-sided that I don't know how anyone could think that they are unbiased, and yet they are still the main source of news for average Americans who want simple, unbiased coverage. This is a problem. No matter who our president is, we should respect them. I respected Obama, even when I hated most of his policies. I respect Trump, even though I dislike his rhetoric. I respect Joe Biden simply because he is our president, even though if I were in his position, I would do basically the opposite of everything he does. Does this put the president above reproach? No. But if half the country hates the leader, how can that country stand? We need to transition from hatred to resolved peacefulness, but not always compliance or conformity. Don't get those things mixed up. What I mean by resolved peacefulness is forcing oneself to at least agree to disagree, at least when it comes to the president. If there are policies the president supports that you don't, fight the policies, not the man. The media is driving us away from this mindset. They call Trump a racist who refuses to denounce white supremacy, even though I have seen clips with my own eyes of him doing exactly that. They ran with the story of Russian collusion for 3 years with no evidence, and it was proved wrong, but refused to cover scandals involving Ukraine, Joe Biden, and Hunter Biden until after the election. They called Trump's election illegitimate, but when Republicans questioned Biden's results, they refused to acknowledge even the possibility of election fraud or irregularities. I have seen clip after clip of lies from sources like CNN. Some of the articles written read more like activism than news. And when a reporter can stand in front of a burning city and call it a peaceful protest, you know something has to be wrong. Most importantly, they select which stories fit their narrative and refuse to report on anything else. Every time an unarmed black man is killed by police, they go into an uproar, even though statistically you are more likely to get shot if you are white based on the proportions of crime committed and people shot by race. I have never seen them nationally cover the death of a black man to another black man, which is far more likely statistically. Why can't they cover the actual problems America faces? Because everything has to fit into their anti-Trump, anti-conservative, and frankly anti-American narrative of systemic racism and injustice, which can only be proven allegorically and never empirically. The media is dividing us, and many of us don't even know it. Like the Ministry of Truth from 1984, they claim to be truthful, fact-checking what is confirmed to be false. In reality, they only exist to support the party. They can revise history with no consequences, and that is a problem. Watch what you watch, because if a service is free, then you are the product. The election in 2020 was rigged in a sense. I shouldn't get banned for this, hopefully, but probably not by means that most people think of right away when they hear the term voter fraud. I want to be very clear about that. I don't think that widespread voter fraud existed in the 2020 election. And I'm mostly saying that for YouTube, yes, but just, okay, that's out, off the table. You can't ban me, YouTube, please. Anyways, it is possible that Trump's claims of dead people voting, problems with Dominion voting systems, and other forms of fraud are completely false and baseless. Although I've seen the possibility of all that being at least partially true, with my own eyes. But that does not matter. The media rigged the election, not through cheating, but through controlling the minds of voters. Do you think you can think for yourself? Think again. I am very open to the possibility and, in fact, likelihood that I myself have been brainwashed by conservative media, at least partially, although I certainly do my best to get news from non-conservative media when they aren't annoying me to death. Most Americans are not free-thinking, even if they believe to be so, and it is not even really their fault. If they only know the facts their side gives them, how will they ever change sides, unless exposed to alternate forms of information? And even if they do look at alternate information, most people are programmed to basically take their preconceived beliefs and then apply that to what they've heard, and they're much more argumentative and much more closed to other people's reasoning than the reasoning from their own side, which means even if they are exposed to alternate information, they still probably won't change their mind. A notable percentage of Biden voters, enough to change the results of the election, and this was in a poll, said that they would not have voted for Biden if they had known about the Hunter Biden scandal before the election, all the stuff with Ukraine and his laptops, etc. There's a lot going on there. When the media lifts one opponent so high that they can do no wrong, but bashes the other as a racist bigot who got elected illegitimately and ran the worst presidency ever, all while being a threat to democracy who should be impeached, it is no wonder that the former does better than they should. Orwell's party in 1984 believed in three principles: newspeak, the mutability of the past, and doublethink. These all contribute to the idea that ignorance is strength. Newspeak is a new language formed that basically made it impossible to think for oneself. Words could have more than one meaning, and a single root word like good replaced all related words. If something was exceptional, Newspeak would simply say double plus good, or something similar. Opposites would not be necessary, as bad is simply ungood. The result of an unnuanced language, or the result is an unnuanced language that means nothing. Politicians have talked like this for years on both sides. For example, if an accident happened that killed some people, but was meant to be a secret, a politician may say something like, "The operation was not a success and may have sadly impacted the event, leading to the unfortunate loss of several members." They would not say, "My order directly killed 5 people, so I'm sorry." What this does is shift the blame, create a barrier between the one responsible and the tragedy. The media does this all the time. And our society, on a broad level, has accepted new terms, words, and definitions not used just a few years ago. And this reminds me kind of one of the more progressive commentators online, David Pakman. I've seen him in a few debates, and he says, I debate politics, not dictionary definitions. And he refuses to give definitions of words. And that's interesting, because if words have no meaning, if you can't even define the words you are debating, then how are we supposed to have a conversation? It's impossible. Anyways, let's keep going. So, yeah, the society has accepted just recently new terms, words, and definitions that were not used just a few years ago. If you honestly remember, just slightly back in the past, a few years ago, many of the words or terms we now use without thinking were either disputed or new terms entirely that were just made up. For example, only in the last year or two have I seen people add their pronouns to communication. New pronouns have also been invented recently, and more are being invented basically every day. And other terms concerning gender ideology. The main words I have a problem with are words abortion activists use. And this is just because I'm extremely passionate about abortion. Abortion itself is a euphemism for what many would call killing a baby. And I would call it that. Phrases like terminating the pregnancy or removing the fetus hide the harsh reality of what happens when forceps are used to squash the baby's head and pull each body fragment out of the woman. Politicians now even just call abortion women's health care, which is absolutely insane. The media also changes the past, which is the second principle of INCSOC, or English Socialism, in 1984. In the world of radical leftism, even Abraham Lincoln did not show he cared for the lives of people of color, according to a school that changed their name to not include the man who freed the slaves. By the way, did I correctly use the term people of color? Or should I have said black people? African Americans? Colored people? How about those of the minority communities who have historically been under systems of oppression? I don't know. The politically correct ideal has changed a lot over the years, so I honestly don't know how to say anything correctly. Last I checked, Lincoln did more for black people than anyone alive today, and that should be an undisputed fact. Furthermore, last I checked, it was the Democratic Party who were and still are the racists, not the Republicans. The Democratic Party is the party of the KKK, segregationist sympathizer Joe Biden, who has said some pretty racist stuff, and people who now believe that white people are more privileged than black people. The media will still claim that Trump and his supporters are racist, pushing the completely debunked lie that he has never denounced racism, and the lie that when he said find people on both sides, he was including white supremacists who he deliberately excluded in the very same sentence. Listen to the sentence. He excluded white supremacists in the same sentence where he spoke the words, find people on both sides. If the media can get half of the country to believe that something Trump said was racist when he proved that narrative wrong in the very sentence they used to condemn him, they can convince people of anything. Finally, the media encourages doublethink. Doublethink is the ability to simultaneously hold multiple opposing views. For example, according to the media, BLM riots that burn cities for months and kill about 30 people are peaceful protests. But the riot at the Capitol, caused by a hatred for an unrepresentative system that led to the death of maybe about 2 to 5 people, and some people only say 1, and as we learn more, it looks like no officers died as a direct result from the riot, but the one person who did die was shot by Capitol Police. That event is the worst event in our nation's history somehow. I can acknowledge, like they've said it's worse than 9/11, it's worse than Pearl Harbor. I've heard people say that. I can acknowledge that both events are disgraceful and awful, yet somewhat justified in the minds of those protesting. Obviously not fully, but I could see why either protest happened. But because they need to control the narrative, the media cannot admit that. This concept is also how they get people to believe that murdering babies is wrong, that murdering babies is not wrong, that men can be women, which is perhaps the greatest feat of all. It's crazy. These actions all lead to the axiom, ignorance is strength. Big media is only a small part of Big Brother. So next we will talk about the censorship of big tech that directly causes the ignorance of the American population. Before this, I do want to mention the other axioms. So ignorance is strength is the first one. The second axiom is freedom is slavery. It is interesting to note that this particular axiom is probably the hardest to point out, but it is also probably the most important. Firstly, consider how vaccine and mask mandates have been promoted as they supposedly save lives and thus freedom, while in reality they only take away freedom. That's something to ponder, but the real issue here is much deeper, and I'm not really going to get into that here. The real way the axiom freedom is slavery plays out in our society is the idea that freedom is the ability to do whatever you want. I've heard a lot of people say this, and it's simply not true. Liberty does not mean the same thing as licentiousness, and true liberty is the freedom to do what is right. At its core, the underlying issue here is sin. If we live in sin, society would tell us that we are free, but in reality we are slaves to our own evil desires. The Bible talks a lot about this, and many philosophers agree that a person who does whatever they want is not truly free at all. Ask a porn user if he thinks his porn use is an example of freedom. He'll probably say yes. Ask that same porn user to stop watching porn for any decent amount of time, and they will have a very difficult time giving it up. Ask an alcoholic if his drinking is an example of freedom, and he will tell you yes. But ask him to stop drinking, he'll probably get mad at you because he knows he can't, absent some extreme feat of willpower. Sin is slavery. Thus, true freedom only comes from living a moral life. However, many say that pure legalism is not free either. In fact, it is very binding. I would agree. The Bible agrees with this, which is one reason the Pharisees were often ridiculed by Jesus. As Christians, we are not only free from sin, but we are free from the law, as we can't earn our salvation. Basically, what I'm saying is that society seems to believe that atheism is a freeing belief, but in reality, Christianity is the only belief that is truly freeing. Atheism enslaves you to your own evil desires. The third axiom is war is peace. Orwell's party sought to fight an eternal war to keep their power. They constantly were at war, and it didn't matter with who, so they could rid society of extra goods, as extra goods allows for pleasure and free time, which leads to free thinking. They tried to unite the country under a sense of common good while keeping and strengthening their own power and keep the citizens fearful in needing governmental protection and safety. The pandemic, or plandemic as some call it, funny, not really, has directly resulted in the loss of freedom. Businesses are shut down. People are forced to stay inside. We are no longer getting to choose even what we wear or what we put in our own bodies, and we are told to submit, trust the experts and the politicians, because safety and the common good is at stake. Sound familiar? CNN kept a counter of COVID deaths and cases until Trump was out of office. Now, we are being encouraged to support the war in Ukraine. When will this constant war end? We have been fighting someone as a country for almost 30 years straight now. When the fight against COVID is over, now we have a new fight coming. War is peace. If we focus back on the COVID response, Biden warned of a dark winter coming. Nobody believed Trump when he said a vaccine would come by the end of the year. People in the news said he would need a miracle, and yet the vaccine came. This fear-mongering does no good. We should take the virus seriously, protect the vulnerable, but we cannot live in fear. We cannot give up our freedoms when the lockdowns cause more death and destruction than the virus. The CDC recommended opening it up because hunger has gone up, suicide has gone up, and the virus just won't go away, even with a lockdown. We were told 15 days to slow the spread and flatten the curve so we wouldn't overwhelm the hospitals, and we did it. And the hospitals are fine now. The lockdown continued. We started to open, but they shut everything down again. They're dragging this war out so that it seems it will never end. It's been over 2 years now. We have a vaccine, and yet some states were still locked down over a year in. The death rate for young adults and teens is around 0.03%, and yet the vast majority of deaths happen with comorbidities. I say open up, while others say keep closed to continue to protect others. In relation to this argument, we need to stop with the strawman arguments. To those on the left, conservatives do not want people to die of the disease, and almost none of us deny its existence, even if it definitely is not deadly at all for normal, healthy individuals. We just think that there are better options that could allow us to be safe and free. Some of us think that it was a huge plan by the deep state to take more power, but that view is a minority. Not saying it's wrong, but it is a minority position. To those on the right, while I am not a leftist myself, so I can't really speak for them, there are valid arguments to be made that lockdowns were necessary for a short time. I do think we can agree on several things that the media will not admit. Politicians on both sides suck. That's one thing we can agree on, right? Trump maybe could have handled COVID better, but he did not personally cause the death, and he seemed to be doing the best he could by shutting down travel very early on and creating the successful Operation Warp Speed. The media would have us think that everything is his fault. I agree, his rhetoric could have been better to warn us of the danger, but he didn't handle the virus as bad as the media claims. Excuse me. The media shows all of Trump's failures, which he does have, and none of his successes, which he has had as well. They show Democratic politicians like Nancy Pelosi bashing Trump on his handling of the virus, but not maskless Pelosi in Chinatown saying everything was fine in the middle of the pandemic. If the media only showed some semblance of objectivity, people on the right would trust them more, and people on the left would be more able to accept differing opinions. The media is purposely dividing this country while saying we need to unite. They provide subjective lies under the guise of objective truth. Ignorance is strength. The media is the enemy of the people. They act not as independent researchers, but as talking heads of Big Brother. They are the first part of the tri-partite entity of Big Brother, and they are working to keep their power, as well as the power of the establishment politicians they support, above all else. Trump has been banned from Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Discord banned the server called the Donald.win. Pinterest banned pro-Trump related topics. Reddit banned r/Donald Trump. Shopify removed Trump's campaign merchandise by disabling trumpstore.com and shopdonaldjtrump.com. Trump was suspended from Snapchat, and TikTok did its best to censor Trump's speeches and hashtags, even though Trump himself did not use the platform. Twitch banned Trump's account. YouTube handed out strikes to any channel that dared contradict the election narrative, and they took down thousands of videos they claim spread misinformation that include many of Trump's videos. Some of these bans have been permanent. Others were temporary, but I find it quite frightening that these companies can control what we say and who has a voice in this country. So much that they can even ban the president from speaking. Just recently, YouTube took down Trump's appearance on the Full Send podcast for violating community guidelines. Parler, an alternative media site, when people say just build your own alternatives, right? We're trying, was taken off the App Store by Google, and Amazon stopped selling their servers to Parler. Why? The violence possible from an act like this is much greater than any violence Trump could spur. Trump actually was telling rioters at the Capitol to go home, be peaceful, and stand down while he was banned. According to an official statement from Twitter, Trump was banned due to a risk of further incitement of violence, despite the fact that he has never incited violence in the first place. I could care less about Trump getting banned, as I don't follow him, just personally. I don't even have Twitter. But his removal does not bode well for the future of free speech in America. If they can ban even the president for not for anything he said, but for something he could say in the future, then they can ban anyone for any reason. This is no longer a slippery slope argument. This is reality. Our speech can be censored. The argument that private companies can choose what goes on their site is somewhat valid. However, they would then be a publisher, not a platform, and currently they are treated as platforms legally. This is a big problem, but it is too complex to go into all of the details, and it doesn't really relate to my overall argument, so I'm just going to kind of gloss over this point. Also, these companies are so big that they basically create an oligarchy that can control the political landscape. The second argument supporting big tech's right to ban speech is that we could just start a new platform that is more free. The problem with this, despite the fact that we already tried with Parler, is that it is hard to overthrow established sites as powerful as Twitter and Facebook, but also that we have already tried and are still being denied the right to speak freely by these huge mega corporations. Parler was supposed to be the site for more freedom, yet big tech was trying to get rid of Parler as well. Why? What right do Google and Amazon have to say what Parler can and can't do with their platform? They have no right, but they interfere anyways because they feel a need to keep their narrative, supported by big media, which we just talked about, as the only narrative people see. That narrative also helps the last section of Big Brother, the traditional big government. That's what most people think about when they hear the phrase Big Brother. I'm saying there's three parts. It is also just very hard to create competition in this market because most leftists don't care about free speech issues on social media. In fact, many support these huge companies banning people for misinformation because only opposing viewpoints to their own are banned. This means that any alternatives that do work will probably be used by mostly conservatives, which kind of defeats the whole point of free speech, because if the people who need to hear opposing viewpoints are people who have different views, if everyone has the same views and no opposing viewpoints are heard, and free speech is meaningless. The final argument is one against free speech in general. That basically just boils down to it could hurt people. First of all, no, it can't. Second of all, just because speech is allowed doesn't mean you have to listen. Third of all, who decides what speech is harmful? Right now it is big tech, but eventually it will be the government. And it kind of already is because they're kind of working together. Why does this matter? If the government is to decide what speech is acceptable, they could decide against you. Let's say that a law is passed in the future that you don't really like. Perhaps they make it legal to beat your wife, right? I think we would all disagree with that law if she calls you a name. Most people would be against this law, including myself, by the way. Just saying that. So they would try to protest, obviously. However, one of the protests results in a local shop's windows getting broken. So the government declares the protest to be inciting violence. They ban all protests of the law and put people in jail if they don't agree. Is this a world we want to live in? Too late. We already do. Big tech can ban you, ostracize you, make you lose your job, and much more if you simply say the wrong thing. In fact, I have a small example of my own already. For years, I watched YouTube videos without ever commenting on a video. My mother didn't really want me to, first of all. And she was just like, she knew that the comment section of YouTube was pretty toxic. She's like, Jaden, don't look at the comments. And I didn't. When I got older, I started looking at the comments more. I started maybe making a few comments of my own. The past few months, however, I became a comment warrior. I've kind of slowed this down. Mostly on the videos I liked. I was just like, hey, cool job. However, there are a few instances where I saw a video that I disagreed with completely and felt compelled to comment a rebuttal, which is completely useless, by the way. I know this does basically nothing most of the time, but I felt like someone had to defend the truth, so I did. I only made a few comments. It wasn't like I was making 20 comments on every video I disagreed with. I did try to always respond to people who responded to me, as I always want to be the last voice in an argument. It's one of the ways you win, kind of. Anyways, I commented on a video talking about how men can get pregnant, and I basically said, in a lot more words, no, only women can get pregnant. Obviously, some people took offense to this, tried to argue, but I dismantled their arguments pretty easily because it isn't too hard to argue that men and women are men and women are women. There is a definite difference between the two, and the argument went back and forth, and the reason I say this, and the reason I say I won, is that one person, who is trans himself, by the way, I have no clue what his gender actually is, but I would assume it was male, because he obviously had male aggression. Yeah, he had a final response to my comment, which basically said, "How dare you?" His argument was that times change. I was a traditionalist who didn't respect people. Trans people couldn't even walk outside of the house without being afraid, and I was somehow making that worse. First of all, every corporation and the vast majority of the government and country agrees with you. Even many neoconservatives and Christians now believe in modern gender ideology. I don't know how a trans person would feel scared in today's society. However, I gave him that point and simply responded with a fairly long response about how I was speaking the truth, which is really the most loving thing I can do. And you may not like it, but it is loving in my eyes because it is the truth. Speaking the truth is always loving. You should do it in a loving way, but speaking the truth is loving. It was a long response, talking about God's role in all of this, how I thought society is collapsing, the gospel, and a whole lot of other things, really. It was meant to be a respectful end to the discussion that simultaneously proved my point. I tried to post this response, but YouTube wouldn't let me. I tried again and again, but got the same error message. I reloaded the comment. After I copied my response, I reloaded the page, right? But I couldn't find my original comment or the response chain anywhere. It just disappeared. YouTube, maybe by the suggestion of this person or another person, removed my comment without any reason or warning. Nothing I said was not true. Nothing I said was in any way hateful or profane or anything like that. I violated no community guidelines, and even if I did, they didn't tell me why my comment was removed, so I wouldn't know, but I didn't. They were able to silence my opinion and halt a discussion I was having with someone I disagreed with, and I can only assume it was simply because they didn't agree with me. YouTube, a part of Google, one of the biggest corporations on earth that controls a huge amount of information and speech, was able to ban my comment for no reason other than the content being an opinion they didn't like. This is censorship. YouTube is a platform, not a publisher. So they are a designated vehicle for free speech by the government. Our speech is no longer free. I've seen many other examples of this, so don't just take my example. There are many. And it will only get worse barring a miracle. As once we give those in power the ability to take away freedom, they will continue to do so until either they have all the power or we wake up and rebel. The argument between conservatives is whether we should follow more liberal policies and allow all speech, even speech that harms us, when we have power, or if we should stoop to the level of the left by censoring their speech when we get the chance. For now, I think it is best that we just take the power back first, and then decide how to use it so that evil forces do not get back in power, as they have. Facebook, or now Meta, Google, by the way, when I wrote this essay, Facebook was not Meta. Things change, man. Google, Amazon, and Twitter have monopolized the way we communicate online. They get rid of competition like Parler, and they work together to make sure that only speech they like is allowed. Twitter banned the New York Post for publishing a story on Hunter Biden's corruption before the election. This was no mistake. They want Biden in office because they know that he will do nothing, at least for now. The speech they allow supports him. I am warning you that they can turn on Biden too. They probably won't now, as they seem to love the establishment, and Biden is an embodiment of an establishment politician. Even now, they are claiming that the economy is the best it's ever been, when normal working Americans are struggling because of inflation. They actually claim this. And when they do admit that the economy is not going so great, now they just blame it on something like Ukraine, right? Eternal war. Great. So, ignorance is strength. Whose strength? The strength of Big Brother, of which Big Tech is a part of. Big Media is a part as well. We talked about that earlier. But both lead to the support of their final member, Big Government. Politicians want power. The only reason they seem to support popular sovereignty is because they have to, but they do not actually believe in the idea. Our government is supposed to be chosen by the people, and technically it still is, but if you look deeper, you'll find that it isn't. When establishment politicians can work with the established media and the biggest, most powerful corporations our country has ever seen to control the narrative and stay in power, they will. Why are cities like Baltimore, Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, and Atlanta eternally in the hands of Democrats? Even when it is clear that these cities are failing, the Democratic candidate always seems to win. Do they have the city's best interest in mind? Probably not, as they have been in power for so long that they do not seem to understand the struggles of normal Americans. They win because they vote not on behalf of the people, but on behalf of big media and big tech to keep the population hearing exactly what they want to continue to get elected. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Money in politics is a huge issue. In my opinion, politicians should have term limits. They should get paid the median income of their state, and they should be banned from participating in the stock market. How are politicians so rich compared to normal Americans? They don't work normal jobs. They don't how are they so rich? Something is wrong, right? All politicians seem to be rich. Big businesses financially support politicians who support them, either through legislation they like or subsidies. And so the politicians the businesses stay in power, right? It is a circle of corruption that serves itself. Socialists actually get this right, but they believe in giving the government more power, even though that is the problem in the first place. What the socialist fails to realize is that our government and our big businesses are basically one unit, working together to stay in power. An interesting observation I've had is that many establishment politicians seem to be in favor of external conflicts. What I mean by this is that they seem to believe that whenever something happens in the world outside of America that threatens what we call democracy, America should step in to protect them. Biden pulling out of Afghanistan, while poorly executed, was actually a step that I support. It was a surprising move. I support it. Trump was slowly pulling troops out of Afghanistan as well, and I supported that. I think it would have been better to do it a little more slowly, like Trump was doing, instead of the quick exit that Biden was doing and leaving the millions or billions or whatever of dollars of equipment back for the terrorists to use. But whatever, right? I support the general idea. However, eternal war, as we've said earlier, is needed to keep people in power. So now many politicians support getting involved in Ukraine. We are already supporting them financially and by placing embargoes on Russia, and I don't think we should really even be doing that. First of all, we are doing our best to make the Russian people mad at us without actually harming Russia, the country, or the Russian government very much at all. Many Russians are against the war, so why would we punish them? Also, some of our punishments simply suck. No McDonald's or Pornhub in Russia? Oh no, can we ban them from America too? That's what I want. Especially Pornhub and all porn in general. Should be banned, definitely. It's not free speech. Get out of here. Sounds more like a reward to ban Pornhub. Second of all, we are supporting American values abroad whenever we are supporting foreign nations. This is explicitly stated by those in power. We always support pro-American value regimes that are democratic, right? That's what we're doing. What values, right now, does the American empire represent? Maybe we used to stand for something better than drag queen empowerment and pedophilia, but now the American empire should not be spreading its values across the world. In fact, we should be doing whatever we can to prevent our postmodern values from spreading. I don't want people in Africa learning about gender ideology and that's not something they can do. Only rich countries have the privilege of being whiny brats like we are. Anyways, on a separate note, nationalism gets portrayed by many as harmful, and it certainly can be overdone. Germany, 1940s, whatever. But globalism is the inevitable enemy of freedom and prosperity. Why is it inevitable? One only has to look at historic trends and what is currently happening to see that eventually there will be a single world government. Eventually. This is not a conspiracy. Just look at the trends of the world. Also, look at the Bible. That implies it. And we should fight this for as long as possible. It may not happen in the next 50 years. It may not happen in the next 500 years. It may not happen in the next millennia, but eventually it will happen. There are already plans to build a one religion headquarters for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And technology, as well as globalist regimes like the United States, are pushing towards this. Plus, the Bible seems to predict it. There's a lot of dispute on that because it is veiled in a lot of mystery and symbolism. It's not very clear to me. Revelation's confusing. Help. I used to love the book of Revelation, and I still do, but it's so confusing. Anyways, however, even if globalization is not inevitable, we should still fight against it, as a one-world government would be so powerful, it would make our dystopian books look like tales about anarchy. Okay, maybe that's an exaggeration, but the intent is true, nonetheless. The divisive nature of the media definitely contributes to how divided the country is right now. But they are not the underlying issue. After all, the media is made of people. In Washington's farewell address, he talks of a united America. He states that Americans hold approximately the same values and are fighting for the same thing. That may have been true long ago, but the harsh reality is that we don't share nearly as much in common as we used to. Don't get me wrong. I want to find common ground with those I disagree with, and some of us may be overreacting to what the other side is saying. But that does not hide the underlying issue at hand. We really don't share values anymore. When America was founded, the vast majority of Americans supported the same things. Most believed in freedom. Most were Christians. Most believed in traditional family values. And most loved their country. They may have had disputes over how those ideals would play out, like the debate over slavery, but they all believed in similar underlying ideals. Now, that is not the case. Many do not believe in freedom. They fight against the right to bear arms, the right to assemble, and the right to free speech. Many are not Christians, or at least practicing ones. Many, like those in BLM, do not believe in traditional family values like the need for one man and one woman to love each other in the context of marriage while fulfilling their duties. That idea is now outdated to many. Many not only don't love our country, they hate it. They hate the fact that we have had a racist past while ignoring the fact that we are the most free country ever. On an even deeper level, all of these ideas can be traced to an even deeper belief. Do we believe in the one true God of the Bible? Are you saved? If so, then you should believe that we are endowed with certain unalienable rights by a creator that the government cannot provide. The right to free speech and assembly is necessary because we are called to share the gospel, whether the government allows us to or not. You should also believe in the traditional marriage structure as defined by the Bible. Sex should occur in the context of the marriage of one man and one woman, as the man is called to love and provide. You should also love our country, although not more than God, as America has historically been a bright light to other nations, sending missionaries and gifts abroad, protecting freedom. That is not to say our country is perfect, but it isn't always bad either. These underlying beliefs are the foundation of our nation, and if many Americans disagree with them, there's no system in the world that could fix us. Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people, and at least half of America is neither. Our foundational differences go so deep that each side believes that the other side is supportive of murder. Conservatives believe abortion is murder. I'm looking forward to that video essay. That's really one I'm excited about, and I'm putting a lot of time into it, by the way. While liberals believe that misgendering, racism, and sexism deny people's humanity, and they believe conservatives support all these things. These differences are not something that can be resolved purely politically. We'll get into that a little more later. How the left and the right come to conclusions is also different. The right has the tendency to value voices based on what those voices are saying, for the most part, while the left takes identity more into account. The left values ideas of historically oppressed people or minorities. Basically, everyone can identify as a part of this group, with the exception of straight white men. If that sounds racist to you, or sexist, that's because it is. But also keep in mind that to many people in this country, your opinion doesn't matter on a subject unless you have the correct identity. People who are victims automatically should be listened to more than people who supposedly are the oppressors. Political correctness is ruining how we have discussions. Especially on college campuses, speech is straight up banned or strongly ostracized if it doesn't follow the mainstream narrative. Furthermore, the vast majority of college professors are left-leaning. This is very evident in my college experience. Kids who go to college often leave indoctrinated into the leftist ideology, and there's a reason for that. Furthermore, to many college students and citizens of this country, some speech is violence. For example, misgendering a person is violence to some people. Racist jokes or slurs are violence. To the more extreme, voicing any opinion that differs from their own is violence. To many, violent speech requires a violent reaction, and this reaction can be physical. I have seen video after video of protesters screaming at, spitting at, kicking, and punching conservatives who voice even mainstream conservative opinions, not radical like racist opinions, just mainstream. I've seen slushies dumped on conservative speakers. I've seen signs and food stolen from conservatives. All of this, it seems, comes from the left. Ironically, I haven't seen anything about the right doing this to the left on college campuses. It's always the left doing it. Ironically, the side that preaches tolerance and acceptance is pretty intolerant of opposing viewpoints. I do have a video on this coming up, by the way. This is because when tolerance becomes a key moral virtue, anything viewed as intolerant will not be tolerated. It's logically inconsistent, but that's how it works. I have not seen a leftist speaker or activist assaulted in the same way many conservatives get assaulted. The very idea that some people could hear ideas that the left does not agree with infuriates people, even if they won't say it directly. This is why conservatives support free speech more than leftists. The left has all of the institutional power in this country, so they don't need free speech. We do. I would say, and I would make this argument more fully in a later video, it's coming up, that absolute truth and absolute morality cannot exist without God. Regardless, it is evident that the left and the right do not even hold the most basic truths in common. The right believes in two sexes. They also, for the most part, believe that marriage should be between a man and a woman. The left believes in a gender and sex spectrum. These two views of truth stand in opposition. The left believes more in personal feelings, lived experiences, while the right follows what they believe to be logically true. The right is, for the most part, religious, or at least adhering to Judeo-Christian values, while the left is not, and those who claim they are probably aren't. I'll get into that too in a later video. Coming up, we got a lot of stuff going on. Religion is, in fact, the biggest difference between the left and the right. Obviously, these are all generalizations, but for the most part, a conservative worldview is based on the absolute truth found in God. And a leftist, if they believe in absolute truth at all, which many don't, base that truth in science. In other words, even the very basis for where we find knowledge differs vastly, as some believe that there is absolute morality and it comes from God, while others have no basis for absolute morality, even if they claim it exists. Absolute morality cannot exist without some absolute authority to decide morality, which is why atheism cannot honestly, at a deep level, believe in absolute morality, even if they believe in moral truth. In other words, for atheists to be moral, they have to steal from Christian values. They will, of course, provide reasons why it is good to have good morals, like the fact that it benefits the human race. But there is no underlying reason as why is benefiting the human race necessarily a good thing if God didn't exist. If the reason for morality being necessary is self-preservation, as many seem to think, first of all, that doesn't make too much sense, as there are many cases where harming other people could help preserve the self. And most people would say sacrificing oneself to save another is morally righteous. But second of all, why is the preservation of the self even necessarily a good thing? Why do you have any value at all if you are just evolved cells? The point is, and I will expand on this in a later essay, that the very foundation for why we believe what we believe differs vastly across the country. The left and the right also have different views on reality itself, with leftism being based more on subjectivism, feelings, and idealism, conservatism being based on objectivism, facts, and realism. Look at any political issue, and this will be the case. Because of the increasing polarization of our country, it is getting increasingly more difficult to find common ground on even the most basic issues, and this only accelerates the process of polarization. Our society is splitting apart like a snowball rolling down the hill. The less we have in common, the more we feel the need to fight, and the faster we break apart. I'm sure many of you have probably seen that Vox video where they show the graph of how polarization is mostly the right's fault, how it's getting worse. But a simple look at reality shows that really the left is at fault for the majority of the polarization in this country. This is because, by definition, conservatives want to conserve the ways of society. Most conservatives line up with the views of the average American about 50 years ago, and many line up with the values Americans held hundreds of years ago. The biggest change in conservative politics over the last few hundred years is the view on race, as all Americans were more racist 200 years ago. Besides views on race, which have changed for everyone, conservative values have always included promoting traditional family structures, freedom, moral virtue, and overall simply the conservation of biblical values. Both the Democratic Republican Party and the Federalist Party, as well as other parties back in the 18th century, would identify as socially conservative, especially by today's standards. And by the way, when I mention conservatism, leftism, or liberalism, especially in this video essay here, I am referring to, unless otherwise implied, social values, not necessarily economic ones. This is why I use the terms somewhat loosely in this essay. Leftism is just liberalism 20 years later anyways. The main difference between the parties back then, in the 18th century, was the role of government. The Federalists, broadly speaking, wanted more control and power to be given to federal government, as they noticed the failure of the Articles of Confederation, and they wanted to make a correction. Keep in mind that their definition of giving more power to the federal government probably does not match our definition, as the government was a lot more limited back then. The Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson, were more agrarian-focused and wanted a smaller, more decentralized government. Neither party would support the vast majority of the values the current Democratic Party holds. When the Republican Party was formed in the 19th century, most people were still conservative. But there was a growing feminist movement which was not. Now that the Republican Party mostly identifies with conservatives and the Democratic Party with liberals, even the conservative movement has become more progressive slightly as they broadly accept at least the first wave of feminism. For example, I support women's suffrage and rights, and the vast majority of conservatives do as well. There's still debate over whether the idea of first-wave feminism is harmful, as even first-wave feminists were very progressive in their views of gender, according to many, as they caused second-wave feminism, which less conservatives agree with. But that doesn't matter too much as it relates to this discussion. The point is that this change is one towards the liberal side of the spectrum, not away from it. This pattern is seen even more today, as many so-called conservatives support the affirmation of transgender people, which is something the Conservative Party of the past would never do. Therefore, the Conservative Party has actually become more progressive-leaning recently, so the increasing divide can't really be blamed on conservatism. Definitionally, conservatives do not change as much, as we are trying to conserve traditional values. The most conservatives can do is fight to prevent change. Therefore, it is simply illogical to claim that the Conservative Party has somehow become increasingly extreme, especially considering the fact that many conservatives are far more liberal than conservatives of the past. The liberal ideology definitionally requires societal progression as an ideal, thus the word progressivism. And so, if society makes what in their mind is progress, they must alter their beliefs to progress further. This is why the increase in the acceptance of transgender ideology has happened so rapidly. This is also why liberalism is the cause of polarization in our nation. To put it another way, the right has shifted slightly left. The left has shifted much further left. Thus, the left is the cause of the polarization. Even Obama changed his view on gay marriage once he became president. Right? He did not support gay marriage. He supported man and woman traditional marriage before he got elected. Was it really that he simply realized the error in his ways? Or did society's progression to greater acceptance of gay marriage push him into that belief? The latter explanation makes more sense in my view. Anyways, the left and the right seem to often simply vote against each other regardless of the content of the policy, although this is not always the case. No side is willing to compromise with the other, and for good reason, as we disagree, so nothing ever gets done. When a compromise is done, the bill passed often does nothing, like the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. This bill has bipartisan support, and I get it, because there's nothing necessarily wrong with the bill. But lynching has been a crime for years, in more ways than one. A federal crime. And modern-day lynchings are basically non-existent. They are non-existent. Some point to the Ahmaud Arbery tragedy as a modern-day lynching, but it really isn't anything. And there really isn't anything else that qualifies, even if one agrees that the Arbery case counts, which many do not. So, what exactly did this bill accomplish? Its sole purpose was to make members of Congress look better for ending lynching and Joe Biden, when in reality lynching ended a long time ago. I would be surprised if more than 5 people break this law within the next decade. Even if they do, whatever they would do that breaks this law would have already broken a host of other laws. I acknowledge that, to some extent, the Constitution purposefully created a system to make it hard for the federal government to do its job. That's kind of the point of some of the checks and balances. Ultimately, that was a wise thing because it kept the government overreach at bay for a time. However, the executive branch specifically has become so broad and so powerful due to presidents who gradually kept adding powers and abilities to the branch that did not exist beforehand, that whatever party wins the White House, in a sense, wins the country. Plus, there are so many unelected bureaucrats in the executive branch that it would be difficult to weed out corruption if it existed, and it most certainly does. This is the main problem Trump had. He said he would drain the swamp, and I do believe he tried, but he was nowhere close to doing so. What this results in is a corrupt, self-serving system that never changes, a government that has grown way bigger than any founder intended, and a legislative branch that only compromises to pass useless laws that boost their own image, or harmful laws that everyone hates, basically. When compromise exists, either nothing happens or the Republican Party loses ground. Our system sucks, and it's not because of the Constitution, which has worked for centuries. Our system sucks because corrupt people have created the perfect conditions to keep themselves in power by controlling the narrative and keeping people dumb and less moral. Besides this, compromise, forgiveness, or reconciliation of such a huge divide cannot be achieved through human measures. True forgiveness and reconciliation is only possible if we recognize and achieve God's forgiveness and reconciliation of ourselves. Non-Christian forgiveness is self-serving and shallow, seeking mostly to free the self from bondage to the one who has wronged the forgiver. Deeper forgiveness of big issues is not possible without God, and without the knowledge that He forgave us so strongly that even though we rejected Him, He sent His own Son to die for us. America takes in a lot of immigrants, both legal and illegal. We also have no official state language and no real sense of shared culture. Why are we a country if we don't hold anything in common at all, and we have no real border security? At this point, our country is basically just a bunch of people who all live in the same area. A lot of people identify themselves with their sending home country, if they're immigrants, or a racial group over the fact that they're an American. Why do we focus so much on Black Americans, Mexican Americans, Irish Americans, Asian Americans, and Native Americans? Why aren't we all just American? If a person is born in America, they're American by default. And we can allow some people to come to America from other nations if they know basic things about America and clearly support being American, so that they can simply be American as well. Every group in America has a specific culture they don't want others to be a part of, and they don't want people in their group to leave. For example, Black culture, from what I've heard from Black people, seems to want all Black people to share this culture, and they don't open it to anyone else. And that's fine. But taken to the extreme, this means that American culture is overlooked and separated by identity group. We can't be this divided as a country if we want to survive. So, we, as a country, have no common values, no common truth, no common sense, and no common compromise. One of the things that is related to this, specifically with the now accepted idea that women and men are interchangeable and have no defined roles, is that the family unit is breaking down. This is a huge problem, and one of the main reasons our country will either be destroyed completely or reformed. We simply cannot last as a society following the ideas many seem to follow. A commonly known statistic that is easily Googled is the divorce rate, which currently sits at about 50%. Almost half of all marriages end in divorce in this country. According to some studies, common reasons for divorce include premarital pregnancy, living together before marriage, or having no religious affiliation, and other things like marrying young or having limited education or resources. However, the average age of marriage has actually gone up recently, and the divorce rate remains high, which is interesting. Today, marriages are defined by some as not just between one man and one woman. Polyamorous relationships are more accepted now than ever. Gay or lesbian marriage is legal and more accepted than ever. And the traditional family structure of one man marrying one woman and having kids seems to be dying. This is a problem. First of all, homosexual relationships biologically cannot result in reproduction, which is one of the main points of marriage. Children need a committed mother and father. It is one of the best ways to ensure success later in life. Furthermore, the traditional gender roles our society has held for so long were put in place to maximize the potential of the relationship. What do I mean by this? God created Adam, who needed a companion helper, so God created Eve out of Adam. God made men and women different for a purpose, as we have different strengths and weaknesses. As a general rule, although there are exceptions, men are physically stronger than women. Men also have the unique and important ability. Women have the unique and important ability to bear children, not men. That's an important distinction there. I almost messed that up. And they uniquely excel at being caring. This is not to say men cannot care for children. This is not to say a woman cannot do physical labor. But, for the most part, relationships work best when each member is doing what they're made to do. I'll get into this a lot more in another video, but the traditional family structure is the best option available for society. Another result of the gender-confused society we live in is that it creates a culture that encourages men to be more feminine. This, along with the fact that our society has not been riddled with hardships compared to other times in history, as there has been relative peace and security in America, and technology has made our lives a lot easier as the quality of living consistently rises for all Americans, means that the modern man is weak. As the saying goes, hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. We are living in a period of weak men, and I'm mostly talking about spiritual and mental weakness, although not exclusively, and hard times are coming. The final and most basic cause of all of America's problems is this: we, as a country, have lost Christianity as a guiding force. The reason Christianity has dwindled is twofold. First of all, the church has been really terrible at boldly proclaiming the truth of God's word. False teachers have taken a hold of many Christians. Many professing Christians are lukewarm people who submit to the culture rather than the Bible, and many of the true believers are too cowardly to share their faith. Thankfully, I know of people and churches who still hold fast to the truth of God's word and boldly proclaim it, but I do think the number of churches that do so has dwindled. However, much of this is actually caused by the second reason Christianity is losing ground in modern culture. The reason the many churches are caving to the modern culture is that culture has shifted to one where acceptance is the main virtue, and churches in the past were not seen as very accepting. So, the church of the past often was too legalistic, and it turned many people off. Not only did people leave the church, thus influencing the culture as their bad church experience made them preach their own religion of acceptance, as Christianity for them focused too much on judgment, and we did, maybe to some extent, but the church overreacted by focusing solely on God's love and not on his judgment. I have 2 more video essays that will go into more depth of the issues with the church, but basically, we need a balance between God's love and his judgment, as though those two qualities are not mutually exclusive. Because the church has lost tremendous ground in the culture, our culture has become increasingly less moral, Thus, our Constitution is less suited for our nation, as it was made with a moral people in mind. This is the true underlying problem with our nation. So, how do we fix it? The first possibility for change is a political revolution. This is the change I see suggested by many conservatives, but I don't see it as a viable option. First of all, with every mega corporation and government agency pushing against us, a physical revolution would be nearly impossible. Plus, it would waste a lot of valuable lives, and I don't think our country is ready for even the idea of this yet. I don't think any single action the government has done recently is grounds for violence, especially because I don't think violence will be able to fix the issue. Not only will people be killed, which is never a good option, but the public opinion would be against us because of the media coverage, and we would not get enough support to make an impact. Violence is almost never a good answer. Even our founders knew this, as they wanted to leave the tyranny of England peacefully, and only fought when England tried to stop us and, increase taxes. And then they used the Boston Massacre as propaganda to, stir up the rebellion. And it was great because that rebellion was awesome. And Britain sucks. Okay, not anymore. Britain, you're my friend. Anyways, even the Boston Massacre wasn't too violent at first. It could have been a lot worse than throwing rocks, although that would hurt. Until the British shot and killed people, right? So Americans started throwing rocks, British shot and killed people, which ultimately provoked the war as they killed protesters. So Americans had a just reason to fight back. Our government, while bad, hasn't killed anyone as far as we know, although it's not like Epstein killed himself. So violence would not be warranted yet. Plus, during the American Revolution, most colonists were on board with the revolution. This simply would not be the case today, so any attempt at revolution would not work. Not. Also, Washington did talk about this. He basically said that revolution like this only works in a very small number of cases, and I just don't think ours is the case. If the revolution is more just one that happens within the bounds of our political system, that would be better, as it would mean no one would die. But it would certainly, it just wouldn't fix our underlying problem. The Constitution still would not work, as people would still be inclined towards evil. So no form of revolution would work to fix our country in the current political climate. Another thing I hear conservatives say is that if people only took individual responsibility to rise up, work hard, vote for good candidates, and raise good families, our country would be better. I agree that it would be, but this once again is a temporary fix. First of all, how are we going to get leftists to simply stop being entitled narcissists and start working hard at fixing our country? We won't. Second of all, this solution once again does not do much to solve the underlying problem with our society. The final solution that could fix our nation is the only one that will work, and it will work eventually if Jesus doesn't come first, and that is this. We need to win the spiritual battle of truth in our nation. As previously mentioned, the two main groups in American politics have different values stemming from different beliefs that ultimately have different sources of truth. If we want to take back our nation, we need to do one thing. And Jesus says it in Matthew 28:19 and 20. Make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. God will be with us if we do this, and it will solve every problem we have in the long run. If every true believer spoke the truth of the gospel and lived it out with their lives by loving people and leading holy lives, people would come to Christ. If we then discipled those people and our children to be active fighters for God, they would spread his message even more. Just think about the impact we could have. If we teach those same people to follow Jesus as we do by leading virtuous lives, our country would be more moral. We would have more similar beliefs, a better source of truth, and a world that rejected the dangerous ideologies that led to our country's downfall. This is the only way we can win. I thought I would end with scripture, as that is always a good thing to end on. This whole series really could be summed up in Romans 1, so that is what I will read, starting in verse 16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal men and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. Thank you for listening. God bless.